Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Happy Friday. We are delighted and honored to have our legal expert here with us today, Wes Furlong, Senior Staff Attorney at NARF out of the Anchorage office. And he will be leading our discussion today. So I'm going to lurk in the background as well. I think most of you have met Wes, but I will let him introduce himself as he begins to talk too. I think we all know why we're here today. So first of all, I'll say that we're recording for anyone who has to step away or anyone who's not on, and we will make this available later for viewing, or I guess rather sooner since the deadline is coming up. And so we want everyone to feel like this is a comfortable space. So Wes is going to have a presentation for us. Feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat box, and then we will save some time for audio discussion and questions at the end as well. We're going to be talking about the proposed changes that we finally have seen from the National Park Service regarding Bulletin 38, traditional cultural places. And Wes is going to walk us through what he sees as some of the highlights for better or for worse, and what we are planning to include in our draft comment letter, which we will send around to you as soon as possible so that you can use that as well. And then we also want to hear from you if there's anything that you think we're missing and or that you plan to include in your comment letter. I think, as always, we are stronger together in these things, and all of you are much more expert in these issues than I am, and I am curious to hear what your thoughts on the revisions are as well, so that we can combine forces and try to use this opportunity to implement some long overdue change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wes.
Thanks, Valerie. Good morning, everyone. As Valerie said, my name is Wes Furlong. I'm the Senior Staff Attorney with the Native American Rights Fund in our Anchorage, Alaska office. So it's certainly morning for us here. Probably morning for most people, it's called too, but I feel like often I'm the only person that it's still morning for. Yeah, so I'm gonna go, I have everyone's favorite, some PowerPoints. I'll just preface this by saying I hate PowerPoint presentations, so bear with me as I go through some of them. My sort of agenda, if you can call it that, for today is to go through some of the highlights, as Valerie said, of the draft bulletin that was put out last October. I think there are a number of things that are positive changes that I'm glad to see included, that were not in the original version that we are all using now, or that have benefited from additional clarification. But there are also parts of it that I think could be changed. And so I'm just going to go. I'll share my screen here in a moment, but I'll sort of walk through some of these, in particular, some of the specific things that I've caught in my review, and sort of and walk through some of my at least my thoughts on them. These, my review has been informed by my experience working on National Register nominations, as well as various Section 106 reviews. And so the comments in the review that I had of this draft are come out of my experience, and of course everyone's going to have different experiences with this. So part of what we want to hear from today is what you all have, things that you're thinking about in reviewing this draft based on your experiences, and as we pull together draft comments for NACPO, we want to be sure that we're hearing from everyone here, so we can include if there are things that we have missed or overlooked or just didn't think about because it didn't come up in the experiences that we've had working with the National Register. We want to be sure to be inclusive of those comments and concerns as well. So let's see, I will do this. Oh, the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So I will hold off doing that until maybe Valerie can give me access to do that. But I can start by, you know, we're
no, hold on. I think
sort
I
of
need
some
to co-host. I need to adjust our Zoom settings. Sorry.
So I can sort of briefly go over a couple things about sort of this process.
Here,
You know,
it should
there
be
was
okay
a
now.
number of the work now. Oh, look at that. I have a lot of screens to pick the right one.
Oversharing.
There we go. Does everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's the second slide. So here's the first slide. All right. And I can go back to this. I can put my email in the chat as well later on. But
do you want to put it in slideshow mode?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to put it in slideshow mode?
There we go. I don't know if that makes it any better because you guys see my whole presenter mode.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I'll just keep it out. There we go. That's the problem with sharing screens. So I'll be sure to put this in the chat later on. But you know, feel free to reach directly out to me with any comments. I would encourage you also to include certainly include Valerie on there as well. But you can certainly reach out directly to me with any comments or concerns about what you have all seen in this draft. You know, any suggestions or things that you think that we should include, or things that you're planning on including in comments. We want to see those. So I'm certainly available to you know, receive all those, and to you know, if there's folks who want to talk about it, I'm certainly available, and that's the best way to get a hold of me. All right, so where are we? We're, you know, the bulletins, you know, the original draft was published over 30 years ago. The Obama administration began revising it. I am now questioning whether it was 2012 or 2014, but the Obama administration began revisions to Bulletin 38, which were stopped by then Secretary Zinke. I'm sure to no one's surprise, and then have been restarted under the Biden administration. And the draft that we have was put out, I believe it was October. And if you have not looked at them yet, this is the link to see it, to get a copy of the document. And I'll also mention that we will share this presentation with folks too, so that you can use this as a resource as you go through it. All right, so next one. One of the biggest sort of first things that we're going to see with a change is that the name of TCPs have been changed from traditional cultural property, traditional cultural place. This was largely done based on what the draft have said, based on concerns that were raised by various communities and tribes, and I'm sure individuals, about the use of the word property to describe these culturally significant places, and concerns about how it sort of commodifies the resource in a way that may be inappropriate for certain cultural perspectives and values. I also think that the use of the word property sort of connotes a discrete, easily definable geographic area, and that place is a little bit more ambiguous, and maybe sort of a better representation of the types of places that tribes are often concerned about or are talking about when they talk about TCPs. This also has the definition. There's some slight syntax changes to it, but the definition of a TCP has not really changed. So we are still talking about the same thing with relatively the same guidance and the same definition. I think the detail of this bulletin and sort of how it should be applied and considerations that people need to be making as they go through identifying TCPs is what has changed, but ultimately the definition has really not changed. So we're not talking about something fundamentally different. Place versus property. All right, so I'm going to go through. As I said, I pulled out some specific language throughout the bulletin that I think is either a positive change that either was not in the original bulletin, and that from at least my perspective is good to see in this draft, or that was in the original bulletin but maybe not as explicit as it could have been. And so it's helpful to have sort of it be teased out more in this draft. And then as this one sort of would imply, this slide specifically, there's also examples language that I pulled out where I think there needs to be potentially some changes to for some clarification or potentially removing of language. So this is going to be sort of structured in the way that I think NAFPO's comments ultimately will be structured, sort of going through maybe not line by line, but pulling out individual parts of the bulletin and commenting on them. And I don't want to spend, I obviously want to be sure that everyone gets, here's what we have to say, what I've pulled out, but I also want to make sure we have enough time for folks to be able to talk about what they've seen and what they would like to see the bulletin reflect or changes that they'd like to be made. So I'll go through this. I don't know if I can see comment. If anyone puts any questions or comments in the chat, I don't know if I can see that in presenter mode, in share screen mode. So if
We'll help you with that, Wes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so if anyone, if there's questions that come up as I go through this, before we get to our part where we can have a more open conversation, I'll try to answer those as they come up. So in the bulletin, they provide examples of TCPs, and one of them includes, as the language is here, a landscape or geographic feature with or without evidence of human modification or other activity. The thing that sort of I pulled out from this is evidence, with or without evidence of human modification, to me implied that a TCP, a cultural landscape, or a TCP needs to have been modified by humans, but that you don't need to actually have to see the evidence of that modification. And I think there needs to be clarification kind of throughout this bulletin that there does not need to be that a TCP, a cultural landscape, does not need to have been modified by, it can be a completely natural landscape or a natural features, but that this to me sort of implies that there is a sort of an explicit understanding that there needs to be some sort of human modification to the landscape, whether that can be seen or not. But I don't think that that's necessarily true. And so we're going to encourage that there should be some revisions that make it clear that when we're talking about these sorts of properties, they can be entirely natural based, and that nothing in them needs to be human made or evidence left of human activity, whether that's archaeological evidence or trails or culturally modified trees or petroglyphs, whatever it might be, that those are not, none of that is necessary within a property for it to be A, eligible, and B, considered a TCP. Oh, and actually now for some reason I can't see the chat. So this is great. I'm going to put this on my other screen so I can see that.
No questions yet, Wes.
Perfect. All right. Continued use. This is one of the ones that I think is a good update to the bulletin that I don't think the original draft, the current draft, made clear, and actually I think actually may have sort of been problematic. So the current version says that continued use by a group of a TCP you do not need to show continued use of a TCP for it to be eligible and to be considered a TCP. And the example they give here is obviously, removal and termination and the genocide against Native Americans, and the TCPs are obviously not tribe specific. This is, I think this is a good clarification that TCPs do not need to be actively used, I guess for a better word, by a tribe or any individual community for them to retain their significance and be considered TCPs and eligible for the National Register. I think this is important to include because the current bulletin is not very clear on this, and actually the Advisory Council has published guidance in the past clarifying the differences between TCPs and places of traditional religious and cultural significance. And one of the big points that they make in contrasting those two is that their reading of the current version of Bulletin 38 is that that a TCP needs to be continually used by a community to be a TCP, and that a place of traditional religious and cultural significance does not. And for a variety of reasons, places of cultural significance are not continuously used, either because of the history of genocide and removal, or other reasons, right? Cultural reasons that you may not actually be allowed to go to a specific place because it's culturally significant, or you only go, or people only go there certain times of year, or over, there's long periods of time where it's not used. There's many different reasons why a place may not be currently used by a community, that it still retains significance. So this is, I think, a really good, this is helpful clarification, and a change from the original current draft, that I think that better reflects the reality that that places do not need to be continuously used to retain significance. And a question about boundaries.
Boundary question.
Yeah, so I do actually have a point. I'm gonna defer answering that question for right now, because I do actually have a slide later on specifically about boundaries. But I will be certain to address that, because we are going to be addressing the boundary issue, and I know that's one that I think is pervasive, and I'm sure probably everyone has dealt with to some degree. But I'm going to be absolutely sure to answer the boundary question, or at least I'm going to discuss some of the things that we'll be raising in our comments about boundaries. Community expertise. This is another one that I think is a really important inclusion, and I would actually encourage there to be more repetition of this point throughout the bulletin, and in a very explicit language, because this is something that I have come across with folks either who are, anthropologists or archaeologists, or whatever their ologist is, members of state review boards and SHPOs who all think that they know more about these places than the tribes do. And I've been in a state review board meeting where the SHPO very explicitly said, it essentially said, I know more about this than they do, they're wrong. And I was with my client who was the president of the tribe, and he had to leave the room. He was so upset. So a very unique circumstance, but I think it's very important that it's in here. It's hinted at in the original bulletin, but I think it benefits from being made explicit that the people who value these places are the experts about the place. And so I think this is helpful. This is good language, and we're going to encourage the Park Service to repeat it. I mean, saying, usually don't need to say things multiple times, but I think it's helpful to really drive home the point, particularly, when we're dealing with folks who just don't want to accept this. It's helpful to have it repeated in the bulletin. So we'll be making that recommendation, but this is something that we're glad to see in here, because I think it is a big change from the current draft, which does not make this it implies it, but it does not make it as explicit as it could be or should be. So this is one that I've flagged because places versus intangible heritage. So the bulletin, as all bulletins do and the National Register does, obviously are, intangible parts of cultural heritage cannot be listed on the National Register. The name obviously includes the word place, and the Park Service, as I think somewhat understandably takes the position that they need to be an actual place to be listed on the National Register. However, in my opinion, there is nothing that explicitly requires something to be a quote unquote place to be listed on the National Register. There's nothing in the statute or the regulations that require that. And indeed, the definition of object makes it very clear that something does not need to be a place to be listed on the National Register. As a historic boat, for example, a ship can be listed on the National Register, and I don't think a ship is a place. Moreover, the bulletin gives examples about how specific trees or rock outcrops can be listed on the National Register, be considered TCPs. I think those are not necessarily quote unquote places. So, this is something that I think we're going to, just raise as a point that not everything that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places is a quote unquote place. And I think when we're particularly talking about TCPs, we're not always, it can be the case where we're talking about resources that wouldn't necessarily be considered places. So I just think we want to see clarification here that we're being consistent. See, ethnocentrism. This is in the original bulletin. I don't think much has really changed with this. This is important to address. I've relied on the current language in there many times to address and rebut things that have been said by SHPOs or state review boards. But I particularly pointed this one out as there's an example provided here that I think is a little concerning to us, just based on sort of the tone it sort of takes and anyway, it can be revised, and I think that there's some revisions to this that I think we can that can be made to make this not be as concerning as it is currently drafted. And this is this bulletin is going to go out. It's going to be the foundational document for determining the eligibility of these resources, and so we want to make sure that it's respectful of the history and the cultures and the perspectives of tribes and other communities that are going to be utilizing this. So we're going to be addressing some of these examples that are important to make, but could be done in a way that is could be done in a better way. So that's sort of I guess, the extent I have on that one. So reasonable efforts, I have a few comments on this. And this goes to sort of the level of effort that individuals who are documenting and identifying TCPs need to go to in order to, satisfy the National Register standards. And this one is perhaps probably the most concerning part, or has raised the most concerns for us. And so I'm just going to kind of go through these. It's the next two slides here, but there's some nuance, I think, in the bulletin that is lost. In particular, I think it needs to do a better job of coming out explicitly and stating, that, so it says in a number of instances that communities, and I'm just going to use the word communities because in Bulletin 38 context, we're not just only talking about tribes, and I don't think this is necessarily a tribe-specific concern, but communities, it says that communities, individuals and members of communities may be, resistant or hesitant or not willing to talk about their culturally significant places, their TCPs, and that's all true, well and true. But I think it needs to be more explicit that there are many instances where it is prohibited, where individuals are prohibited from talking about them. As a function of their culture and their upbringing and who they are as a people, that it is culturally inappropriate or prohibited or taboo to talk about even the existence of places. Not just the location, not just what's important about them, but whether they even exist in the first place. And so there's sort of a theme in this section of the bulletin draft that sort of talks about like what do this imaginary you is sort of like some, I guess, researcher who's coming into a community to do research or identification work for TCPs. And I'll just skip ahead to this next slide. So, I mean, it's a little small, but I'll just read here. In some cases, a community's current political leadership may be resistant to discussing traditional matters. As a result, it may be necessary to adjust the scope of the research to ask only enough information to confirm a place meets the criteria, and nothing more. So this may be fine. This recommendation may be fine in certain circumstances, but what's concerning is sort of the underlying tone in this section of the draft really implies that there's like an obligation that whomever this outside person is, that they have some right to be able to come in and identify these things, and that they need to figure out a way of getting the community to talk about it, and change their approach to get them to talk about it. And these are resources that are not outside communities' resources. And if they're coming to a community that is saying, we're not going to talk to you about it, that needs to be the end of the conversation, right? Like they need to take that, understand that, and leave. And this isn't particularly important when I think it's particularly important when it comes to tribes as sovereign governments who have the absolute legal authority to condition the work that these individuals can do when they come into Indian country to do this sort of research. And if a tribal government says you can't do it, that needs to be the end of the conversation. And there needs to be no more like, well, I'm going to find a way of doing it. No, that needs to be it. And the tribes have ultimate control over this. These are their resources. These are their culturally significant places. They are the ones that own this information, that are the cultural owners of this. And if they're saying we're not talking about it, that needs to be the end of the conversation. So I think this sort of finding a way of kind of getting around it, or what can we get out of it when they're not as open to it as we want them to be, to me, it it doesn't matter. If they're saying no, that needs to be the end of the conversation. Now, this, you know, there's no need for someone, and this is sort of premised on my feeling that there's really no need ever for someone to just roll into a community and go, hey, I'm here to document your historic properties and list them on the National Register. You know, I think for all, you know, I think for historic preservation generally, but particularly when we're talking about TCPs, identifying them and doing this work, if it's decided that that should be something that's done, needs to be internal, needs to be community driven. Outside people coming in and doing this is not appropriate unless they're invited in to do it. So this to me sort of comes from a problematic premise that someone can just have some sort of entitlement to roll into a community and do this work and sort of bring the community along with them. That's not how this should work. I'll caveat that by saying it becomes slightly different, I think, when we're talking about ongoing Section 106 reviews. And I think that's potentially the only time where there is potentially a need to identify historic properties because there's something actually happening and it's being triggered by an actual regulatory obligation that a federal agency has, unlike just listing properties for the sake of listing them. I mean, this comes up a lot in Section 106 reviews where tribes are not willing or not able to talk about resources. The existence of them, the location of them, what's important about them. But I tend to think that is a problem. I don't want to say a problem. That is a circumstance that's better addressed in the Section 106 process through consultation and potentially by the advisory council rather than the Park Service in Bulletin 38. That to me is more of a Section 106 concern than a specific how is this place eligible concern. Because if we take this out of the Section 106 context, I don't think that there should ever be an instance where someone is just rolling into a community and saying, hey, I'm here to document your TCPs, tell me about them. That's not how this should work. And particularly with tribal community, with tribes and tribal governments being able to say, have the authority and the obligation to tell people no, if that's what they decide to do. So we're going to be raising some concerns about this sort of part of it in particular, the approach that, I guess researchers, for the lack of a better word, the sort of the guidance it's giving them on how to approach communities about doing this work. Because I think there's nuance to doing this in Indian country that's different than in other communities that may fall, that may have TCPs, particularly because we're talking about sovereign tribal governments, which will lead me to a broader point sort of at the end about the need for the potential need for tribal specific guidance, and not using this sort of catch-all approach that is applicable to any community that ascribes cultural significance to places, and sort of lumping tribes in with sort of any other traditional community.
Wes, we do have some comments in the chat here that I wanted to make sure you saw. As always, very insightful comment from Kurt here. I'll give you a moment to read, and then a question from Al regarding the definition of community.
Yeah, so the comment about training, I mean, I think that's sort of a concern that I think is pervasive within this sort of area of work, right? Is we have trained archaeologists who are the one that are doing all this, and that's, it drives the perspective of the work that they're doing. And, I mean, I think there's still underlying the whole, the whole National Register program, the National Historic Preservation Act itself is all, very focused on sort of tangible material things. And it prioritizes the preservation of material things, and it prioritizes the disciplines that focus on material things. And that is may be appropriate for certain resources, but I think, often for what tribes are concerned about, that's not appropriate. And having, archaeologists are not necessarily the appropriate person to be doing this sort of work. And, I have certainly fought with agencies over, the qualification of their people, and ensuring that they have people who meet the Secretary of Interior standards, which I'm not going to hold out as saying are anything good. But I've certainly fought with them over that, you're an agency and you have to meet these standards. My tribal clients do not, and they get to decide who the expert is, and they get to pick. It's their resource, and they're the ones that get to decide who the experts are. And there is nothing that an agency should be able to say about that. I mean, that's sort of my thought on it, is the tribe is the quote unquote expert, and there may be individuals within the tribe who are really the expert. And that can be whoever the tribe identifies as being the expert, and based on whatever the experience is that the tribe understands or believes or knows to be relevant. In some cases that may be a formally trained archaeologist with a master's or something, but often it's not, and it's the people who retain the traditional knowledge. And that needs to be explicitly recognized by agencies. I think this bulletin starts to get there. I think it's helpful to have additional language that very much explicitly recognizes that the experts from the community are whomever the community says they are, regardless of sort of the quote unquote formal training that they could have in historic preservation or archaeology or something.
So similarly, this question about definition of community, do we have any thoughts on that? Clarify.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I don't know, so like my perspective and coming from this, I come from working with tribes, and if it's the tribes as governments are the ones that get to say who's going to be, from my work, it's the tribe that is the one that's the entity, the community, if you will, that's ascribing the significance to a place, and is the one that's doing this work either through a nomination process or in the Section 106 process. But within that, it may not be the entire tribe that ascribes significance to it. It may be a particular family within the tribe. And so I think it could certainly include a particular family. I do represent some Native Hawaiian organizations, and one of my Native Hawaiian organizational clients is a family, specifically specifically an actual family, and they, as a family, are a Native Hawaiian organization that has the same consultative rights that any other Native Hawaiian organization or Indian tribe would have under Section 106. So I think I certainly think a community could be a family. I think from the approach that I come from this, that I'm coming from this, is that I'm working exclusively with tribal nations and tribal governments, but I don't think that's necessarily. I think it probably could be. Let's see, a comment here about tribal expertise. Yeah, I think being more explicit, Part 800 in particular does require agencies to specifically defer to the expertise. Well, it could do a better job of that, but it does mention it in Part 800 regulations. So, bringing these, making these consistent, I think is good, and clearer would be better. Yeah. Let's see, so many comments. A lot of them are reactions. Okay, let's see. Olga has a comment about likelihood that such places may be present is concerning for agencies who are not open to identifying TCPs as a way out. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an inherent problem. I think that's an inherent problem, so I think part of this is the bulletin needs to clarify that these places can exist, whether or not anyone outside the community knows about them. And the fact that someone may not talk about it or is not talking about it does not mean that they don't exist. To me, that becomes a quote unquote problem in the Section 106 context, where an agency is moving forward and a tribe is not able or not willing to talk about the existence of properties. And yeah, I mean, it's a real balancing act in how to convey that information, if it even can be, and whether it's just going to have to be accepted that we can't talk about it, and what's going to happen is going to happen. I've been in instances where that's been the decision that's been made. Yeah, so I think there's need and room here in this bulletin to clarify that it may be culturally impossible or not allowed for tribes to talk, or individuals to talk about these places. But I think solving that, what does that mean for agencies as they do projects? I think that potential to me is sort of outside the ambit of what the Park Service can really opine on in this bulletin, and that needs to be addressed, I think, first and foremost in that consultation. And I think it would be that's something that I think would be helpful to see from the Advisory Council on more guidance on how to deal with that circumstance.
Thanks for addressing those comments. Do you want to get back to your slides?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm almost done here, so we can open it up. So this criterion A1, this is talking about sort of the time period of significance for quite filling out the nomination form, and it's clarifying that it's not relevant in some instances to really provide a detailed date for the significant when a property had its significance, or that significance began, because we're often talking about places that have been significant since time immemorial, or since the beginning of time, the creation of the world, for example. I think this can be expanded upon, because I have seen state review boards and SHPOs push back very hard on nominations that say, where the part that says, what is the period of significance, and we just wrote since time immemorial, and that's not okay. You need to give us a date. And so I think clarification that is absolutely appropriate is helpful. This is sort of goes there, but I think it can be more explicit. This is another kind of comment about districts. There's a statement in here about, they're talking about districts, and they say a TCP may be a district if it possesses a significant collection of buildings, structures, sites, or objects united historically, that are united. And it doesn't say this, but it sort of implies by the use of the words building, structures, sites, and objects, that the contributing resources of a district themselves need to be either listed or eligible historic properties, because those are the definitions of the various types of historic properties. This is not necessarily just a Bulletin 38 comment, but a broader Park Service guidance comment that should clarify, and in here particular should clarify that the contributing resources to districts, those contributing resources themselves do not need to be properties or do not need to be potentially eligible properties. They can be completely ineligible. They do not need to meet these definitions of building structures, sites, or objects to be contributing to the overall significance of a district. So that needs clarification, I think, particularly here, but also more broadly as part of the Park Service's broader guidance on the National Register. Yeah, and then criterion D, which is, you know, everyone's least favorite criterion. You know, as this comment states, you know, I have really strong concerns about using criterion D to applying criterion D to TCPs. And, you know, one of these comments mentioned, you know, the over reliance on archaeologists by agencies to do this sort of identification work for TCPs, who the only thing that they see of value of it is the archaeological material that's there. And so the knee jerk for agencies, if they're, you know, if you get them to even be willing to consider TCPs, like, oh, well, it's only eligible under criterion D. And if it's only eligible under criterion D, then it's very easy from the agency's perspective to, you know, mitigate those effects by, you know, going in and removing the archaeological material. But so, you know, I just have a lot of concerns about using criterion D to convey the significance of TCPs. But I will say, if it is going to be used, it does not need to be only archaeological information that the TCP has value with. That there's other value that can be learned, that can be conveyed by a TCP that's not simply focused on archaeological material and the value that it has for archaeological investigations. So I think being sure to clarify that the value that, and I hate using this word value, so forgive me, but the value that TCPs can have is beyond, it goes beyond just sort of what the archaeological record may show. All right, so this is my last real slide, and this has kind of been going a little longer than I anticipated, but I'm going to briefly go through this. We've talked about some of this already, particularly these are things that have come up in at least my review of this draft, but these are not necessarily Bulletin 38 TCP specific concerns. But I think that there's some particular they may be sort of more emphasized when we're talking about TCP. So we've talked about this one already, but districts, you know, there needs to be, I think, and this is based on my experience in dealing with states, is there needs to be more explicit guidance and statements from the Park Service, either in Bulletin 38 or the other National Register bulletins, about the fact that districts themselves do not need to contain any built structures or evidence of human occupation to be eligible, and that entirely natural landscapes may be eligible as districts. And on top of that, that even if there are built structures and other things like that within a district, that none of them need to be identified as contributing resources to the district for that district to be eligible. And that does not necessarily, and that they exist within the district does not necessarily mean that it does not, that property retains integrity. So that's just something that I've had long, like, drag out, knockdown fights about with states before and agencies. And so being, I think, very explicit about that, I think, will be very beneficial. The big one that I think I promise I'd get back to is boundaries. I mean, this is one that just never goes away, and it's never going to go away. In particular, when we're talking about TCPs, when we're talking about cultural landscapes, it is often antithetical to a tribe's way of life and understanding and worldview to draw arbitrary boundaries around properties in order to nominate them to the National Register. I think we are going to be encouraging the Park Service to reevaluate their requirement that nominations include boundaries. I don't think there's any legal requirement that they do need to have boundaries. I think this is simply a policy decision that the Park Service has made, that it requires to have a boundary, but it is not required in the statute, and the regulations do not require a boundary to be delineated. It's so I think there's flexibility the Park Service can have to say we don't need boundaries. And I think that they have that flexibility to say that for particular types of properties. And we're talking about cultural landscapes, TCPs, places of traditional, religious, and cultural significance, where it is really, really inappropriate to put boundaries on it. I think the Park Service has the flexibility to say, yeah, we don't need to do boundaries. We don't need a boundary to be drawn. And, you know, we all do this in the Section 106 process already, where we don't need to draw boundaries around historic properties when we're engaged in the Section 106 process. And the Park Service has issued formal determinations of eligibility from Section 106 reviews, where they've explicitly stated that they do not need to draw a boundary. And if a determination of eligibility and a formal listing are legally the same thing in terms of like its importance and what that means for the Section 106 process, there's no reason that there should be no reason that a boundary doesn't need to be drawn for a DOE, but it needs to be drawn for a nomination. And I'd also point out that the Park Service lists many multi-property nominations on the National Register, where they identify a type of resource and a type of significance, and that it doesn't, and that multiple properties across a broad landscape can then be listed as long as they meet that same kind of, they meet that significance of the multi-property nomination. And I think there are already examples of the Park Service sort of taking a far more flexible approach to boundaries. And we're going to strongly encourage that they need to really reconsider their insistence that boundaries need to be placed on particular TCPs. I don't think, other than policy, there's a real requirement that they do that. And I think it is, you know, we're all perfectly capable of proceeding in Section 106 reviews without drawing boundaries. And if that's really the only meaningful thing that comes out of a nomination, then I personally don't see what the problem is. Granted, I'm not a Fed, but that's been my position. And I think we're going to be really, you know, our comments are going to be addressing the boundary concern and the fact that we don't think that that needs to happen. And finally, my last sort of general comments, you know, we're talking about Bulletin 38 and these revisions, but from my perspective, I think, you know, we could get like a perfect Bulletin 38, right? That every tribe thinks is perfect. It does everything we want it to be, is exactly what we all want it to be. That is not going to address, I think, the broader concerns that tribes have with the National Register program. Because I think those concerns are bigger than just the guidance that the Park Service has published for documenting TCPs. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is no way for tribes and TIPOs to nominate property to the National Register, but they have to go to a federal preservation officer or a SHPO and ask them to do it for them. And that's just inherently anti-sovereign. And it is there's a lot of problems with that, having to basically submit to state jurisdiction over a program that really is ultimately a federal program, is not appropriate. And having to go through the state review board process and have the SHPO opine on whether they think the tribe's TCPs are eligible. This is not an appropriate process. And I think there is a need for the Park Service to address that, because until that is addressed, I think there's those sort of broader issues about the National Register program are going to persist, and we can have a much better Bulletin 38, but tribes are not going to participate in the National Register program simply because of that. I think there's more fundamental issues that need to be addressed. It's the process itself, it's the documentation, the expectation of what counts as sufficient documentation. There's a lot in there that is, I think, really problematic and makes it really, and what do we get out of listing it on the National Register? A somewhat vague guarantee that an agency is going to consider it in Section 106 process down the road. So, I mean, based on, my experience, I would be hard pressed to ever recommend to a tribe to go through this process and nominate a property because of these concerns. So these obviously cannot be addressed by Bulletin 38, but I think these are part of the broader concerns about tribal participation in this program, and so we're going to be raising those. The other one that was raised when we spoke about this at the NAFCO conference in February, I don't remember who raised this, but someone raised the concern that Bulletin 38 itself is, as I've been talking about too, is not specific to tribes. That it goes out of its way of saying that there's a lot of examples of tribally significant, or places that are significant to tribes, but that the guidance is not specific to tribal resources, and that sort of any traditional community can utilize Bulletin 38. And it was raised at the conference in February that is problematic to equate tribes to just any other traditional community because of tribes' sovereign status, their government-to-government relationship with the United States. This is one thing that we're also thinking about including, is whether there is the need for tribe, and fortunately, since this is open, I can edit this as we go. That should be NHO, not NHP, tribal and Native Hawaiian organization specific guidance about these sorts of properties. And so, there's part of that, which is tribes are sovereign governments that all other traditional communities in the United States are not, and have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government that no one else has. But the other part of that too is the National Historic Preservation Act specifically, explicitly recognizes that properties of traditional, religious, and cultural significance to Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations are eligible for inclusion on the National Register. So I think there's the sovereign status of tribes, their political relationship with the federal government, and then the National Historic Preservation Act's explicit recognition of significant properties to only tribes and NHOs. That I think all those things combined could be the basis for separate guidance for documenting places of traditional importance to tribes in the National Register, within the National Register program. And a lot of the comments that we're going to be raising that we've talked about, particularly with reasonable efforts, how to go to a community and document their TCPs. There's particular nuance to that in Indian country when you're going to tribes that you wouldn't be doing or you wouldn't be considering if you're going to just any other traditional community. So there's potentially the need, and I think I certainly see the space there for tribal specific guidance, tribal NHO specific guidance for places of traditional, religious, and cultural significance that's separate from Bulletin 38 and TCP guidance. But, I think it begs a broader question of, outside the Section 106 context, is that something that, Indian country wants, and particularly with the National Register program, whether, I think there's other systemic issues that I think need to be addressed other than sort of tribal specific guidance, that would make it more palatable for tribes to engage in this program. So those are sort of these broader, not necessarily Bulletin 38 specific comments that we're also going to be raising, because I think they, it's important that these issues be raised. I think Bulletin 38 and his revisions sort of touch upon them. So that's what we're going to be, this is sort of the highlight of what we're going to be commenting on. And then the last slide here is just sort of, the information about submitting it. The deadline is coming up. It's a Sunday at, I think that's actually supposed to be 11:59. I'm editing my PowerPoint as we're talking about it. But midnight Mountain Time on Sunday, April 30th is the deadline to submit comments. And there's 3 ways of doing that. There's a link and a comment form on the Park Service website, and the URL's there. And we're going to be sure to share this so that people have that. You can also just Google Bulletin 38 revisions, and there's a series of links that will take you to it. There's also an email address to send them, or you can mail them by hard copy to the Park Service. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That's sort of the overview of what I've been looking at and thinking about, and I would love to hear what other folks are thinking about, concerned about, potentially going to be commenting on. We've kind of skipped over a bunch of comments too, so I don't know, do we just open it up? I think we have
Yeah, let's start with the ones in the chat box. Thanks so much, Wes. I think that was a really thorough yet somewhat concise summary of some of the fine-grained things that we're planning to comment on in the context of some of the bigger picture issues as well. And a number of those are also being called out here in the chat box. We've got some questions about Criterion E. We also heard some talk about that during our conference as well, and tribal registers. So I'll just give you a minute to review some of the comments and questions in the chat here and see if there's
well, I'll just jump on those because I saw those. Yeah, I mean, I'll start with tribal. I mean, I think it's, I would encourage any tribe that has the, the capacity, just because, I think these things can be, it can take a lot of resources to do, but I think we've certainly worked with a number of tribes and have encouraged tribes to develop their own register. We've done that formally. I think we've helped at least one tribe up here in Alaska actually develop a tribal code that establishes a formal tribal register of historic places. I can't remember exactly what it was called. We've done that very formally. We've also done that more informally by just sort of going through a lot of the identification work that would be required if we were doing a nomination or a determination of eligibility in the Section 106 process, and doing it proactively, and then just retaining the information for the tribe to have. But I think tribally led registers are important, and I think it's a really good thing to do. I think particularly if the tribe has the resources and capacity to do it, I wouldn't want to burden a tribe with it if they don't really have the ability to do that, staff wise or resources or something. But I think it's a strong act of self-determination to be able to do that. I think the problem that I see is getting states, SHPOs, and federal agencies to recognize it. Right, because the National Historic Preservation Act only, Section 106 in particular only talks about historic properties that meet the National Register criteria, and that are listed on the National Register or eligible for inclusion on the National Register. And so I think it's important. I think it can be an important, act of self-determination for tribes to develop their own, but it becomes a broader question of are agencies and states going to recognize that? And they should. I mean, I think that, they should be recognizing the expertise of tribes. And I don't want to say that I wouldn't want to recommend that tribes develop their own register that basically mirrors the criteria that the National Register does, because I think it should be self-driven about what the tribe itself values. But that, I think, will always sort of be a question mark that hangs out, that kind of hangs over that, is getting agencies to recognize that. But in some way, maybe that's not as important, or as big of a concern, because it may allow the tribe to do a lot of proactive work in kind of gathering information about the significance of places, to have it if it is needed in another context. So I'd certainly encourage tribes to do that if they feel it's something that they want to do. I think it's an important thing to do, not just within the 106 context, but within their own community, to have that information there for people, and to hold that in a way that's if it needs to be accessible or not, but to have that, I think it's an important thing. The other one that I'm seeing here is criterion E. I don't know if NAPCO has a specific position. I do. I think it would be a good, another one of those things that I think could be helpful in addressing some of the systemic problems with the National Register program, and having a tribal / Native Hawaiian organization specific criterion that is not tied to the original 4 that have been there forever. I don't know what that exactly looks like. I know there's been a number of examples that have been presented over the years, but I find it a very interesting concept, and I think in principle, I think I'm certainly in support of it. I don't know what it looks like, but the idea of it, I think I certainly think would be a good step towards making the register better reflect tribal perspectives on their resources, and address some of those issues.
Let's do it.
Let's see. Yeah, and if there's a lot of comments and reactions in here, so I mean, it may also just help for folks to just raise their hand.
Catherine's got a hand raised.
Yeah, or just ask the questions too, because I don't want, otherwise I'm just sit here and scroll through these and miss them.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi, all. And for folks who don't know me, I'm the State Historic Preservation Officer in Arizona. And we are going to be providing written comment on this revision to Bulletin 38. And we are also going to go in detail through all of the provisions and, talk about, sort of the non sequiturs and the some of the changes that really don't work in practice. But I think the overarching comment that our office is going to make is that there are some epistemological issues at work here. And I think this is what Kurt was driving at, Kurt Dongoski with Zuni was driving at as well, is that the whole concept of a register just seems to be, problematic for tribe to meet tribes' needs. From what I hear from the tribes that I consult with, there is a reluctance to draw boundaries. There is a reluctance to compartmentalize or check a box with limited significance. There is a reluctance to assign a period of significance. The National Register, let's just all be honest here, does not work well for these particular types of properties or places that tribes require consideration for and preservation. That's just period. So, I mean, I know it sounds glib to say square peg round hole, but I feel like this revision to Bulletin 38 is a whole lot of banging. It's a whole lot of making noise and banging on that peg to try to get it to go through, and it's just not going to go through. Now, I think where Kurt and I, it seems like we disagree, is I don't think we can throw the baby out with the bathwater, because to do so would be to fail to recognize that historic properties play a fundamental role in Section 106 compliance. So if we take traditional cultural places that are significant from tribes and put them in another register, or have tribes maintain their own register, quite honestly, tribes will lose out. Our federal agencies will not take them into consideration. I don't see us opening up Section 106 without creating a humongously dangerous situation. So I really do feel that the tweak has to happen with the National Register. And it seems to me that if you tweak not just, I think the tweak needs to be with the area of significance. And that is because what that will allow us to do as professionals in cultural resource management, both tribal, SHPO, and even the consulting community, if they need to be involved, which in the case of TCPs is sometimes is very difficult. But what it will allow for is it will allow for a different set of identification standards. There won't be a reliance on counting things. There won't be a reliance on everything having to be tangible and pointed to, or even like discrete boundaries. Like you could call something a site or a district and characterize the landscape qualities and the vegetative qualities and the cultural practices, the intangible values. If we do that, if we create an entirely separate category for evaluating significance. Integrity considerations, I think, will also be very much handled appropriately that way. So that's kind of where I am leaning. And of course, I never make decisions in a vacuum when it comes to resources that are important to the tribes. So I just wanted to kind of poll the organization and see if anyone else feels similarly, or if I need to temper my thinking on this. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely used the term square peg and round hole to describe the National Historic Preservation Act, and I mean, I think that's, I mean, it is a little glib, but I mean, that is what it is. I mean, the statute was enacted in 1966 without a single thought given to tribes, and with the real intention of preserving historic buildings and battlefields and historic resources that are not necessarily important to tribes, or the types of resources that tribes are concerned about. And tribes involvement in the register, in the NHPA, in Section 106, you know, I think really precipitating with the 1992 amendments. I mean, they're amendments to the act, and they're sort of trying to put tribes into the framework that has already existed. And so we're already, I think, you know, tribes involvement in these programs and processes is already sort of predicated on this underlying conflict that the statute and the regulations and the processes and the programs that we're working with and dealing with are not, and never were intended to represent or be capable of representing these types of resources, or being a culturally appropriate way of addressing these resources. So yeah, I mean, I think we're fundamentally working in a law and a system that is not intended to address these types of resources and really be inclusive of tribes, and that we've had to sort of, and that tribes involvement has, over the past couple decades, has really been you know, attempt to sort of shoehorn tribal perspectives into the existing framework, rather than creating a new framework, or so I think, you know, I would, you know, there's lots of like little things that I would like to change. There's lots of things I'd like to change about the National Historic Preservation Act, the Part 100 regs, the National Register regulations, and these programs and things. But I mean, fundamentally, what really needs to happen is a fundamental change in culture and federal priorities, and honestly, new federal laws that are specifically addressed to protect these types of resources. but I'm not going to hold my breath that that's going to happen in
Mhm.
the near or long-term future. I mean, I think we're gonna continuously work to towards that. But in the meantime, we're stuck with these really inadequate and inappropriate laws, and we have to kind of figure out the best way of utilizing them as we can. Oh, there's another hand up here.
Is that Brees? Hey, Brees.
Yeah. Hey, I've really appreciate the conversation here and all of the work that NAFCO is doing with this. I do think that it's running, as I'm reading the chat, there's this kind of continual moment of kind of the asymmetric authority in the decision making, in the whether we call this a colonized act, a Euro-American centric bias, etc. I think there's room, and we'll be making a comment along these lines. The wording isn't out yet. That basically the way this TCP language seems to be written is it doesn't recognize the unique status that tribes have, and that there's a false equivalency in drawing tribes into the interests of the Friends of X farm, circa 1903. And that tribes also in that unique status in the government to government relationship are not, have traditionally been relegated to a distant past, not that is a continuum of distant past to the moment. And the wording, the subtleties in the rewording to call reference to places, in some ways erodes that authority, the knowledge, and that unique status of being able to speak to practice that is required or has been traditionally associated in place. So these are just a couple of points that I put out there. Now, to the previous comment, I think it's true. We don't have an alternative path in front of us right now. And in light of that, I think some strong wording to draw out that there is a need to recognize that tribes are their own expert, and make sure that we're not eroding the CFR, as you pointed out earlier, Wes, that in 800, tribes are their experts, and that is being eroded in some of this language here. So my ask as a deputy TIPO for a tribe is, as you're crafting your comments back, to maybe bring that forward, because I think that there's some strength in reminding the federal government of the unique status that they are committed to tribes. So, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the fundamental concerns with Bulletin 38. Out of this draft or the previous draft is it applies to to anyone. I mean, it's not just tribes. I mean, like my Irish ancestors who were sheep farmers in Northern California could have a TCP, or whomever it is. And so yeah, I mean, it's I appreciate the way you put it as a false equivalency between tribes and these other groups. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of delicate because they don't want to downplay the significance of theirs, but I mean, they're just fundamentally it's not the same, right? Like their TCPs are important, and their perspectives are important, and all that. But yeah, they don't have the political relationship with the United States. They are not sovereign governments And yeah, the federal government doesn't have a trust responsibility to them to ensure the protection of these resources. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the, yeah, I mean, that's one of the, it's, we can provide all the, the line edits we want to this bulletin to make it, come across better. But yeah, I mean, that's one of those, and that's one of those things we're going to be, including, I think, sort of in our more general comments is, but, we can make this better, but there's, we can make Bulletin 38 as great as we want it. But yeah, as long as there's sort of these fundamental problems with this program, it's not going to address the concerns that tribes have. And one of those, I mean, one of those is yeah, do we create, is the Park Service creating tribal specific guidance for their own properties? What is that? But yeah, I mean, I think part of me feels like they should just do that just because they shouldn't be lumping tribes in with all these other organizations, all these other groups that may also be using the National Register. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a major problem, and I think it's sort of underlying this. It underlines a lot of Section 106 processes that I see, and actions that tribes are just another stakeholder like everyone else, and we're gonna treat them and approach them the way we would any other community or town or whatever it is, and friends of the citizens of concerned blah blah, whatever it is. It's like they're not, it's not the same. And it needs to be at a bare minimum at least fleshed out in greater detail here, that we're particularly when Bulletin 38 is talking about tribal communities, they're talking about sovereign governments with a unique relationship with the federal government that these other communities don't have. It may be a little like sort of awkward in this document to have that specifically called out, but I think it needs to be. But the other solution for that then is to have a completely separate guidance that deals with that, so you don't have to do it. But I mean, I don't know if that's the answer necessarily, but I think there's room for that. But
I think there are two possibilities. One is an outright statement that, treat this as a needs analysis. It highlights that, what everything in the chat is. And so, federal government, you inadvertently have created an awareness. And now what are you going to do about it? And let's go forward with that. Thank you for putting a spotlight on a big gap. The second part is, why not actually a stronger intent statement about the applicability of this, and that up front, bookend this document with a statement that says, this is for the applicability of A, B, C, and D. However, the federal government has an authority and responsibility to its partner sovereigns through trust responsibilities, etc., to fulfill this. And then a series of points that actually make it a little different. For what it's worth, this is the moment that sits in front of us, and to make a new moment is going to take a decade. So, and I'm speaking just as a single tribe with, I don't want to monopolize here, but I do think that a strong reminder, and in the document as a tribe, if that wording is in there, then it makes it a lot easier for me to come back and go, you're not the expert, says so right here. You have an authority or responsibility to the tribe for these, and I can point back to the source document. So, for what it's worth.
yeah.
And if you don't ask, you guarantee what the answer is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate that suggestion. That hadn't crossed my mind to suggest that as explicitly as sort of a standalone statement at the beginning, and it was, I think, going to be kind of implicit in sort of some of the line comments we were having. But I really appreciate that suggestion of specifically calling out a statement right in the beginning about that, and really, you know, setting off from the very beginning that there is a unique, tribes are not like everyone else that's going to be covered by this, and sort of setting that from page one. I think that's a yeah, I really appreciate that comment. I think we'll include something to that effect in our comments as well. I think that would be very useful. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brees. Can't emphasize that enough. I have a hand raised from Lisa.
Good morning. Thank you, Wesley. I really appreciate your presentation. That was very informative, and will help guide us through presenting our comments or drafting our comments. So, sorry, Lisa Woodward, archivist for the Pechanga Band of Indians in Southern California. So the tribe did elect to nominate their creation and origin area, and it was actually listed. And I want to talk about boundaries. I know that came up earlier. And basically, the tribe was forced to draw boundaries just because of the process of having to notify landowners. So the tribe had to greatly restrict the area that they identify as a creation location because of thousands of property owners that are now, you know, live within those lands. And because it was considered a district, you know, the tribe had over 50%, barely over 50% approval or agreement with the listing. So, you know, now we're in a position where we have a hard, fast boundary, but there's projects occurring adjacent to that boundary that don't technically fall within the nomination area, but are clearly within the creation. So I hear what you're saying about boundaries, but, you know, being in Southern California and there's very little land left around the reservation, it's hard to, well, actually, I should say the tribe is forced into drawing a boundary. So just want
Yeah,
to
I mean, that's been my experience. I mean, one of the first things I worked on when I started at NARF was nominating a cultural landscape here in Alaska, and being forced to artificially put boundaries on it, and, you know, go through the property records and identify all the individual properties that are in it. And yeah, I mean, the requirement that, you know, the ability for landowners to object to the listing of a property is within the statute, and there's nothing that the Park Service can really do to get around that unless the statute is amended. But, you know, I like the problem that I have with it is when we're talking about listing cultural landscapes or TCPs, you know, I get why when the NHPA was first enacted that they have this requirement, because they were thinking about historic districts and urban areas and buildings, and the listing of those types of properties often triggers like mandatory preservation obligations that a city is going to impose on someone. So I get like where that came from, but it's so inapplicable to the types of resources that we're talking about. I mean, we can list a cultural landscape, and there can be, you know, there's certainly could be, you know, within some sort of with municipal boundaries that have some sort of preservation ordinance, but it's not going to be relevant to any of these people that are living there, because that's going to be, you know, we're not listing their house because it's old and unique. It's their property is listed because it's within this broader landscape, and it has, you know, the experience we had is these property owners just being like irate that, you know, we're going to like impose some regulatory thing on them. They're not going to be able to, like, you know, put a new sewer line in or a septic tank and all this stuff. And it's just, you know, it's just not, I think that there's, you know, we have to go through this process because it's in the statute, but it's totally not applicable to the context in most instances that we're really engaging with it in. And it's really frustrating that we have to do it. So I think, you know, particularly for like the private property owners and objecting to it, like that's a statutory fix. I think we're sort of stuck with that, but like, you know, how we define boundaries if we need to, like that sort of thing. I mean, I think that's sort of that's probably part of the reason why the Park Service is making us do it. But like, I think we need to come up with there has to be a better solution than just having to arbitrarily draw lines every time.
Yeah, thank you. Agreed.
There's a question in the chat here about this. Before space boundaries and get landowner consent for actual nomination, can you just fall back to space? Yeah, yeah. I mean, the question is, can't you just like not? I'm assuming this is what the question is not like exclude those parts from the nomination. And I mean, theoretically, you can. I mean, we in some context, right? I think you potentially could. We'd thought about it in one of the nominations I've worked on, but like, you know, maybe you like carve out like a specific inholding or something that's not included in it. But you know, often if you know there's large landowners that hold, you know, large acres of land that are really vital parts of that property, you're not going to be able to do that. Maybe you can like cut out little triangles, little squares here and there, but that may not always be the case. You can certainly do it. But it also sort of just undermines the, like what, you know, it sort of undermines the purpose of listing that property if you're going to carve out all these little places within the middle of it. It just sort of is, yeah, I mean, you certainly can, and we've definitely thought about doing that in certain instances, try to avoid including certain properties so that we don't have that problem. So it certainly can be done, but I think there's just some broader concerns about like what that means for the overall nomination if you're sort of carving out little pieces in the inside of it and saying it's okay if this isn't included in the nomination, because I think then, you know, potentially SHPOs or whoever it might be, you come back and like, whoa, I mean, you're carving out all these little things. I mean, how, you know, if you're carving out all these places and saying they don't need to be included within the property, then is this property really, does it really retain its integrity if all these places are being excluded from it? Which I don't think is a very serious objection, but I think it's one that certainly opponents of the listing of certain properties could run with and make a big deal out of, even if it's legally irrelevant. Yeah, and Jill's comment about leaning on eligibility versus listing. I mean, that's my recommendation. If tribes come to me now and say we want to list something in the National Register, I'm going to strongly encourage them not to. I mean, maybe do the you know, spend the, you know, the time and effort to evaluate it for the significance, so that there is a resource that the tribe has, so that if something does come up in the future, that they have that there and they're not, you know, they can do this work proactively. But you know, the time and expense and concerns about going through the actual nomination process is often is often not worth it. And particularly if you're talking about a property that, you know, you can't put a boundary on. If you go through the nomination process, Parks is going to make you put a boundary on it. You know, if you're only listing it for, if the only reason to list a property is so that it's considered in the Section 106 process, you know, having it listed does not mean that it is, you know, not being listed. It's still going to be needed to be considered. And you have more flexibility, I think, in 106 to not put a boundary on it. You don't have to worry about landowners and all these other regulatory hurdles that you would otherwise need. So that's been my recommendation is it's generally probably not worth it to go through this process. But you know, certainly tribes have done it, and that's their absolute prerogative to do so if they want to. But my initial thoughts are, as it kind of stands right now, it's potentially not worth it to do it. So
Okay, some great questions here. If we haven't gotten to your question or comment, we have been at this for over an hour and a half, and I've been seeing some people need to go elsewhere, which is great. As I mentioned, this is being recorded and will be made available to everyone afterward. But please feel free to raise your hand if you have anything that you would like to ask of Wes or share as far as your observations or comments you might be planning to make.
I just put my email in the chat. I forgot that I said I was going to do that. So that's there. Certainly people can reach out. And I think we're going to also share these slides, though I think the comments that we're going to be drafting are going to be, there's going to be more, these are sort of the highlights. So there's going to be more. And I think, I don't know what the time frame is for sharing those out. I know we're running up to a deadline, but hopefully with enough time that people can see a draft of them and utilize what they have in them for their own comments. And I don't think we're going to be submitting ours probably any earlier than the Friday before it's due, since it's due on a Sunday. So, I mean, I won't speak for Valerie, but I'd certainly encourage, if folks have finished their comments or have drafts that they would like to share with us too, we'd be happy to see those as well. I certainly would be happy to look at those, and maybe there'll be some things in there we want to copy. So plagiarize. So
yeah, I think those were my concluding comments actually. So Wes, if you can send me your presentation, I can go ahead and PDF that and send that out to everyone, along with the link to the recording when Zoom makes that available to me, as well as the comments from the chat box here. I can send that as a text file as well. And then when you do get that draft comment letter ready, I can send that out. And in the meantime, folks will go ahead and have the resources that you have created for this, as well as a discussion today. And as a reminder, that deadline is April 30th, and we will get materials to you before then. And please do send anything that you would like to share with us to me and to Wes, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope that this was helpful. And Wes, as always, thank you. Thank you so much. You are just a gift to NAFPO and to TIPOs and to tribes. And we are so grateful for all of your expertise and services and the time and the care that you put into this. We really appreciate you.
thanks. I'm happy to do it. Always happy. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Friday and have a great weekend and take good care.